Sophia and Isabella were brought to the St. Mary's Orphanage on a stormy night, just a few hours after being born. No one knows exactly who left them at the doorstep, but the sight of two tiny newborns wrapped in a single blanket, one light-skinned and the other dark-skinned, left the staff puzzled. The matron, Mrs. Green, took them in, assigning them the only two cribs left in the infant room, side by side. Growing up, the contrast in their appearances was always a subject of curiosity, not just for the staff, but for anyone who visited the orphanage. Sophia's skin was porcelain fair, her hair a cascade of chestnut waves, while Isabella's complexion was a deep, smooth cocoa, and her hair, coiled and dense, framed her face like a crown. Despite their shared birthday and the undeniable symmetry of their features, it seemed almost impossible to believe they were twins. As they grew, Sophia's bubbly personality shone through. She was always smiling, her laughter echoing through the long, empty hallways. Isabella, however, was quieter, often watching her sister's antics with a patient smile, as if silently protecting her from a world that would inevitably judge them. Their bond was evident in the way they moved together, like two parts of a whole. "Hey, Belle, look. I drew us as princesses," Sophia would say, holding up a crayon drawing with mismatched colors. Isabella would chuckle softly, correcting her. "But you made me blonde like you again, soft," and they would giggle, both knowing Sophia's blunder was a testament to how she saw no difference between them. St. Mary's was their world, a large, aging Victorian house with creaking wooden floors and a musty smell that lingered in the air. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the few toys they had were hand-me-downs from the community. But Sophia and Isabella made do, turning each day into an adventure. However, there was always a feeling of distance between them and the other children. People were polite, but the sisters were often on the outskirts of games, whispers trailing behind them. "They don't look like sisters," a boy once said loudly, and though Sophia brushed it off, Isabella's eyes turned stormy. Over the years, St. Mary's Orphanage became accustomed to seeing potential adoptive families come and go. It was an unsettling routine for the children who longed for a family, but for Sophia and Isabella, the cycle of hope and rejection was particularly cruel. Many families entered the orphanage curious about the charming twin sisters they'd heard about. At first, they were enchanted by Sophia's bright personality and intrigued by Isabella's calm demeanor. "Look at them," Mrs. Green would say, trying to muster a warm smile. "They're inseparable. We'd love for them to stay together." The sisters would sit side by side, holding hands tightly. Sophia's eyes sparkled with hope, and she often started the conversation. "We love to read. Isabella likes science, and I like drawing. Do you have any other brothers or sisters?" a woman asked during one visit. "No, ma'am, just each other," Isabella responded softly, her gaze steady but wary. "Such sweet girls," the woman murmured to her husband. "But are you sure they're sisters?" she asked hesitantly, her eyes shifting between Sophia's fair complexion and Isabella's darker skin. That question was the one that stung the most. They were used to it now, but each time it came up, it was as if someone was placing a wedge between them. "Yes, they are twins," Mrs. Green would respond, her tone a bit firmer. "They've been here together since birth." The couple would nod, but the unease would settle in, the smiles would waver, and they'd make polite excuses to leave soon after. Once, after yet another family had left with their polite but thin smiles, Sophia turned to Isabella. "It's because of how we look, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Isabella tightened her grip on Sophia's hand. "I think they're just not ready for us. But someone will be, Soph. They have to be." Yet, deep inside, she was already bracing herself for disappointment. Isabella learned early on to anticipate the letdowns, feeling the shift in atmosphere every time a family's gaze lingered on their contrasting appearances. The rejections piled up like bricks, building a wall between them and the outside world. Even the other children, who were quick to notice patterns, began to treat them differently. "You guys are never gonna leave, are you?" a boy teased one afternoon. "No one wants two sisters who don't look like sisters." "Shut up, Aaron," Sophia retorted, her cheeks flushed with anger. Isabella said nothing, but that night, she quietly cried into her pillow, her sobs muffled by the thin fabric. Each time a family left without them, she felt it like a physical ache, a reminder that their bond was seen as a flaw, an oddity that kept them from being accepted. Yet, no matter how many times they were overlooked, they refused to let go of each other's hand. The differences between Sophia and Isabella were not just skin-deep. They were mirrored in their personalities as well. Sophia, with her wide-eyed optimism, held onto hope like a lifeline. She was the type to wake up every morning with a smile, her heart set on the possibility that today would be the day someone would choose them. Her bed, neatly made with a small collection of hand-drawn pictures pinned above it, was a testament to her persistent positivity. "Look, Belle, I drew us in a big house with a garden. Maybe our new family will have one, and we can plant flowers," Sophia would say, a hopeful lilt in her voice as she showed her sister yet another colorful sketch. Isabella, on the other hand, was far more guarded. Where Sophia's dreams were bright and vivid, Isabella's were shadowed with caution. She had learned to brace herself for the disappointments that inevitably followed each visit. Her part of the shared room was simpler, the walls bare except for a few books stacked on the windowsill. She preferred to spend her time in silence, reading about faraway places and people she knew she'd probably never meet. "You shouldn't get your hopes up, Soph," Isabella would say quietly whenever her sister started to dream too big. "But what if this time it's different?" Sophia would counter, her eyes pleading for reassurance. Isabella would sigh, looking away. "It won't be. It never is." There was no bitterness in her tone, just the weary acceptance of someone who had seen too many goodbyes. One rainy afternoon, after another failed meeting with prospective parents, Sophia sat by the window, staring at the droplets racing down the glass. "Maybe if we act more alike, they won't mind us being so different," she mused aloud. "Like, if I braid my hair like yours, or if we dress the same." Isabella frowned, shaking her head. "No, Soph. We shouldn't have to pretend to be the same. We are who we are." She paused, her voice softening as she added, "Besides, you love your hair down and I can't stand dresses." Sophia chuckled at that, but there was an underlying sadness in her laughter. I don't understand why it's so hard. Why can't they see we're just like everyone else? We want a family too." The tension between their outlooks grew more palpable as they approached adolescence. Sophia's relentless hope often grated against Isabella's practicality. They would argue in hushed voices late at night, not wanting to wake the other children. "You're just too negative, Belle," Sophia would hiss, frustration lining her voice. "How can we ever get adopted if you don't even believe it'll happen? And you're too naive," Isabella would shoot back, her voice breaking. "I'm tired of watching you get hurt over and over again. I'm just trying to protect us. Can't you see that?" Their arguments never lasted long, though. At the end of each one, Sophia would always whisper, "I'm sorry, Belle. I just want us to be happy." Isabella would reach over, taking Sophia's hand in the dark. "I know, Soph. Me too." And in those quiet moments, when the orphanage was still, they would cling to each other, both wishing they could somehow merge Sophia's hopefulness with Isabella's resilience. The staff at St. Mary's noticed these changes too. Mrs. Green often tried to intervene, offering advice that felt empty even as she said it. "You girls need to support each other," she'd tell them, her tone gentle but firm. "No matter what happens, remember that." And they did. Despite their growing differences, their bond never wavered. They continued to depend on each other, Sophia's laughter balancing Isabella's silence, Isabella's strength supporting Sophia's dreams. It was a delicate equilibrium, one that could easily tip with the smallest disruption. Yet, in each other, they found the only family they knew. One that didn't see skin color or personality clashes. Just two sisters who were, in every sense of the word, inseparable. As the years passed and the sisters moved from childhood to adolescence, the trials they faced together only deepened their connection. Every rejection, every insensitive comment, and every curious stare from visitors or other children in the orphanage served to make Sophia and Isabella lean more heavily on each other. They shared secrets, hopes, and fears in the quiet hours of the night, whispered beneath the thin blankets that barely kept them warm during the harsh winters of Massachusetts. There were moments of pure joy, too, moments that belonged only to them. One afternoon, They sneaked out to the overgrown garden behind the orphanage. The garden was a neglected mess of tangled vines and faded flowers, but Sophia's eyes lit up as if she saw a secret beauty in the chaos. "Isn't it perfect, Belle?" she exclaimed, gesturing at the wilting flowers and scraggly bushes. Isabella crossed her arms skeptically. "It's a mess, Soph." "Maybe, but it's our mess," Sophia said with a grin. She reached down and plucked a single, stubborn daisy that had somehow survived the neglect. Holding it out to her sister, she said, "See? Even here, something beautiful can grow." Isabella took the flower with a small smile. "You're impossible. You know that?" "Yeah, but you still love me," Sophia teased, bumping Isabella's shoulder playfully. "Unfortunately," Isabella replied, but her tone was soft. She placed the daisy behind Sophia's ear, as if acknowledging her sister's unrelenting positivity in a world that seemed to have so little to offer them. Their relationship was complex and layered, a balance of fierce protectiveness and occasional resentment. Sophia's persistent cheerfulness sometimes grated on Isabella's nerves, especially during the difficult days when it felt like their dreams of a family were slipping further away. But Sophia's hope was the lifeline Isabella clung to, and Isabella's strength was the anchor that kept Sophia grounded. One evening, the two sat on their shared bed, knees touching. Sophia glanced at Isabella, a hesitant look in her eyes. "Do you think maybe we don't need anyone else? Maybe it's okay if it's just us?" Isabella looked at her sister, really looked, seeing the cracks in Sophia's optimism, the cracks only she could see. "No, Soph," she murmured, shaking her head. "We deserve more than this place. We deserve a real family. But what if no one wants us?" Sophia whispered, her voice small, a stark contrast to her usual bright tone. Isabella felt a pang in her chest, a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Then we'll make our own family. You and me. We'll find a way out of here one day. Together. Promise." "Promise." Isabella's voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. Their conversations grew deeper as they aged. Sophia, still the dreamer, would talk about what their lives might look like outside the orphanage walls. "We'll have a house, not too big, just enough for us. And maybe a dog. You've always wanted a dog, right?" she'd say, her hands painting pictures in the air. Isabella would listen silently, watching her sister's animated face. "What would you want, Belle?" Sophia would ask, pausing mid-dream to look at her. "Peace," Isabella would reply softly, "and safety." She'd glance away, her gaze distant, as if picturing a life where they didn't have to constantly prove their bond or defend their right to be sisters. As their bond grew stronger, it also became their armor. The outside world's rejection seemed less powerful when they faced it together. Sophia's unwavering belief in their future and Isabella's quiet determination formed an unspoken pact. No matter what happened, they would not let anyone or anything tear them apart. And in those moments, it wasn't just love that bound them. It was survival. The orphanage staff watched with a mixture of admiration and concern. They'd seen siblings come and go, torn apart by separate adoptions or internal rivalries. But Sophia and Isabella were different. Those girls, Mrs. Green often said to the other staff members, "They're like a force of nature. You can't break a bond like that." Even the other children, who had once mocked them, started to sense the strength in the sisters' connection. When a new boy tried to provoke them, saying, "Why do you even bother staying together? No one wants two mismatched kids like you," Isabella's eyes flashed with a protective fire. "Because we're family," she replied coolly, stepping in front of Sophia. "And family sticks together, no matter what." Sophia, standing a step behind, nodded fiercely. "Yeah, we're family, no matter what." It wasn't a plea for acceptance. It was a declaration of who they were and what they would always be. Their bond became their defiance, their silent rebellion against a world that seemed set on keeping them apart. And for Sophia and Isabella, as long as they had each other, they believed they could endure anything. As they entered their teenage years, Sophia and Isabella's questions about their origins became impossible to ignore. The whispers and rumors around the orphanage, the strange looks from staff, and the uncomfortable reactions from visitors all pointed to one undeniable truth: they were different. and the reason for their abandonment might be more complicated than simply being unwanted. One rainy evening, as the wind howled outside their window, Sophia broke the silence that hung heavy between them. "Belle, do you ever wonder why they left us?" Her voice was tentative, as if afraid that voicing the thought would somehow make the pain of it sharper. Isabella didn't look up from the book she was reading. "Not really," she lied, her eyes skimming the page without actually taking in the words. "It doesn't matter, Soph. They left. That's all there is to it." Sophia leaned closer, determination in her gaze. "It does matter. What if they didn't want to leave us? What if something happened?" Isabella snapped the book shut, a rare flare of frustration crossing her face. "What does it matter now, Soph? What could possibly be a good enough reason for them to leave two babies alone in the middle of the night? Whatever it was, it doesn't change anything." But Sophia's mind was set. She had seen the way Mrs. Green and the older staff members looked at them sometimes, sad, almost pitying, and she had caught fragments of hushed conversations over the years. "There's more to it, Belle. I can feel it," Sophia whispered fiercely. "I heard Mrs. Green talking with one of the new caretakers last week. She said something about how our parents didn't have a choice. What do you think that means?" Isabella stared at her sister, her emotions conflicted. She wanted to dismiss it as just another false hope, something to distract them from the hard reality of their situation. But Sophia's words planted a seed of doubt that slowly began to take root. "I think you should stop asking questions, Soph," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. "Don't you want to know?" Sophia pressed, her eyes wide and pleading. "Don't you want to find out why we're here, why we're different?" The word hung in the air between them, different. It was something they had both felt acutely throughout their lives, not just because of the stark contrast in their appearances, but because of the way people reacted to them. They were an anomaly, an enigma that no one seemed able to explain. "Of course I do," Isabella finally admitted, her shoulders slumping as if a great weight had been placed on them. "But what if finding out hurts more than not knowing? What if it's worse than we think?" Sophia reached out, placing a hand on Isabella's arm. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever it is, Belle, I want to know. I need to know." The determination in Sophia's voice left no room for argument, and Isabella felt herself relenting. The truth was, she had always wondered, too. Why had their parents chosen to abandon them? Why had they been left at a place like St. Mary's with no explanation, no note, no promise to return? Their curiosity became a shared obsession. They began scouring the orphanage's meager records, sneaking into the small office late at night, hoping to find any clue that might shed light on their past. But each night ended the same way, with them sitting on the cold floor, surrounded by dusty files that told them nothing more than they already knew. One evening, after another fruitless search, Sophia sighed deeply. "Maybe we should ask Mrs. Green directly. She's been here the longest. She must know something." Isabella hesitated. Confronting Mrs. Green was risky. The woman was stern and protective of the orphanage's history. But Sophia's persistence had lit a fire in Isabella's heart, one she couldn't ignore. "Okay," she said finally, nodding, "but we have to be smart about it. If she thinks we're getting too close, she might shut us down completely." They waited for the right moment, a quiet afternoon when most of the children were out playing and Mrs. Green was alone in her office. Taking a deep breath, Sophia knocked softly on the door. "Come in," Mrs. Green's voice called from inside. The sisters exchanged a look, then stepped into the room. The office was cluttered with paperwork, old photographs, and dusty mementos from decades of running the orphanage. Mrs. Green glanced up, her expression softening as she saw them. "What can I do for you girls?" Sophia stepped forward, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mrs. Green, we have some questions. About when we were brought here." Mrs. Green's eyes flickered, and a guarded look crossed her face. "What sort of questions?" Isabella could feel Sophia's anxiety rising, and placed a calming hand on her sister's back. "We just want to know why, Mrs. Green. Why were we left here? Do you know anything about our parents?" The silence that followed was heavy and tense. Mrs. Green looked at them, a deep sadness in her eyes. For a moment, it seemed like she might brush them off. But then she sighed. rubbing her temples as if trying to ease a lingering headache. Your parents? It's not my place to say, girls. But you should know, it wasn't because they didn't care. Then why? Sophia asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Why did they leave us? Mrs. Green hesitated, then said softly, they were afraid. Afraid of what people might think, of how the world would see you both, and of what it would mean for them. Sophia and Isabella exchanged a confused glance, but Mrs. Green offered no further explanation. That's all I can tell you, she said firmly, her voice leaving no room for more questions. Some things are better left in the past, girls, but Sophia and Isabella knew then that they couldn't let it go. That single, cryptic comment opened up more questions than it answered. Why would their parents have been afraid? And what was it about them that made people so uncomfortable? Whatever the truth was, they were determined to find it, no matter what it cost them. The looming threat of separation crept into their lives one cold winter afternoon. Sophia and Isabella had just turned 15, a critical age at the orphanage. Prospective parents who came looking for children often hesitated to adopt older kids, and the chances of adoption dropped significantly as each year passed. For twins, and especially for Sophia and Isabella, the odds were even slimmer. It was Mrs. Green who broke the news to them. She sat them down in her cluttered office, the worn leather chair creaking softly as she shifted uncomfortably. Girls, there's something we need to discuss, she began, her gaze flickering between them. A couple came by today. They're very interested in adopting. Sophia's face lit up instantly. Really? That's wonderful. When can we meet them? But Mrs. Green's expression didn't match Sophia's excitement. Isabella noticed the tightness around the woman's mouth, the way her hands fidgeted with a stray paperclip. They only want to adopt one of you. Sophia's smile faltered, her heart dropping like a stone. One? She echoed, disbelief lacing her tone. But we're sisters. They know that, right? Mrs. Green nodded, her eyes soft with sympathy. Yes, they know, but they're not interested in taking in both of you. They believe that it might be too difficult to raise two teenagers with such different backgrounds and… Different backgrounds? Isabella interrupted, her voice low and dangerous. We're twins. We've been together our whole lives. How is that different? They mean your appearance, Mrs. Green said quietly, avoiding Isabella's piercing gaze. It's hard for some people to understand. They see you as separate. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sophia looked at her sister, her eyes wide with panic. They can't separate us, Belle. They just can't. Her voice trembled, and she reached out, clutching Isabella's arm as if someone might try to pull them apart right then and there. Isabella swallowed hard, keeping her expression as neutral as she could manage. She had always known this day might come, had felt it hovering like a dark cloud in the distance. But knowing it was a possibility and facing it were two entirely different things. What happens if we say no? She asked evenly. Mrs. Green sighed. I can't force you to go with them, of course. But, girls, you have to consider your future. You won't be able to stay here forever. When you turn 18, you'll age out of the system. If you're not adopted by then, you'll be on your own. Then we'll be on our own, Isabella said firmly, her jaw set. We're not splitting up, Mrs. Green. Tell them we're a package deal. They take both of us or neither. Sophia nodded vigorously, but Mrs. Green shook her head. You don't understand how rare it is to find people willing to adopt older children. This could be your last chance. And, Sophia, she paused, taking a deep breath. They're particularly interested in you. The air seemed to freeze. Sophia's eyes widened, and Isabella's head snapped up sharply. What do you mean, particularly interested in Sophia? Isabella demanded, her voice cold as ice. Mrs. Green glanced at Sophia, then back at Isabella. They feel that Sophia's personality would be a good fit for their family. They're concerned that taking both of you would be too challenging, given how reserved you can be, Isabella. The words struck like a physical blow. Isabella recoiled slightly, her face flushing with a mix of anger and hurt. So, I'm too much of a problem, is that it? That's not what I'm saying, Mrs. Green said quickly, but Isabella wasn't listening. How could they even think of splitting us up? Sophia's voice broke, tears welling in her eyes. Belle, I can't. I can't do this without you. You won't have to, Isabella said fiercely, taking Sophia's hands in her own. We're staying together, no matter what. Mrs. Green leaned forward, her expression imploring. Think carefully, girls. If Sophia has a chance at a family, a real home, shouldn't she take it? Even if it means… No. Isabella's shout cut through the room like a knife. She rose to her feet, pulling Sophia up with her. You think I'd let her go alone? You think she'd be happy without me? We're all each other has. Tell them it's both of us or nothing. But, Mrs. Green began, but Sophia interrupted her. Mrs. Green, please. We've never been apart. We can't be apart. I won't leave without Belle, she said, her voice shaky but determined. Mrs. Green sighed heavily, the weight of years of failed adoptions and broken families etched into the lines of her face. I'll tell them what you said, but promise me you'll think about it. Really think about it. Opportunities like this don't come around often. We don't need to think about it, Isabella said flatly. Our answer won't change. Sophia nodded, clutching her sister's hand even tighter. We're staying together, no matter what. Mrs. Green watched them for a long moment, sadness and resignation mingling in her gaze. All right, girls. I'll let them know. She stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. As they left the office, the sisters walked side by side, their shoulders touching. The other children in the hallway glanced curiously at them, sensing the tension but not daring to ask what had happened. The sisters said nothing as they climbed the stairs to their shared room, where they collapsed onto the bed, still holding onto each other as if letting go might shatter them both. I won't let them take you, Soph, Isabella whispered fiercely, staring up at the ceiling. I don't care what they say. I know, Belle, Sophia murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. I won't let them take me either. We'll figure this out. And as they lay there, tangled together like the roots of a tree, they made an unspoken vow. No matter what happened, no matter who came through those doors with promises of a better life, they would stay together. Because being sisters meant more than sharing the same blood or last name. It meant sharing a life, a bond that no one could sever, no matter how hard they tried. A few weeks after Mrs. Green's ominous announcement, the tension in the orphanage settled into an uneasy calm. The potential adopters hadn't returned, but the conversation lingered like a dark shadow over Sophia and Isabella. It was during this unsettling period that a glimmer of hope appeared, an unexpected hint about their past that rekindled the sisters' determination to find the truth. It happened by chance. One evening, the orphanage was unusually quiet. Most of the children had gone to bed, and the night staff, including Mrs. Green, were preoccupied with administrative tasks. Sophia and Isabella were sitting in their room, the silence stretching between them, when a knock sounded at their door. Who could that be? Sophia whispered, glancing at Isabella. Probably just one of the younger kids, Isabella muttered, but she stood up to answer it anyway. To their surprise, it was Miss Ellen, one of the senior caretakers who had worked at the orphanage for over 2 decades. Miss Ellen rarely ventured into the children's rooms unless there was an emergency. She was a stern woman with a sharp gaze, but tonight, her eyes seemed softer, her expression almost regretful. Can I come in, girls? She asked quietly. Sophia and Isabella exchanged a wary look but nodded. Miss Ellen stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She looked around the small, sparsely decorated room, her gaze lingering on the few personal items the sisters had managed to accumulate over the years. A couple of books, a stack of Sophia's drawings, a small trinket box filled with odd treasures they'd collected. I shouldn't be doing this, Miss Ellen began, her voice low, but I've been thinking a lot about what Mrs. Green told you. About that family who only wanted one of you. Sophia stiffened, but Isabella narrowed her eyes, sensing something in the woman's tone. What are you talking about, Miss Ellen? She asked carefully. The older woman sighed, looking down at her clasped hands. You girls deserve the truth. I've watched you grow up, and, well, you remind me of my own daughters in a way. What happened to you? How you ended up here has always troubled me. What do you know? Sophia asked, her voice almost a whisper. She leaned forward, clutching the edge of the bed. Please, Miss Ellen, tell us. Miss Ellen hesitated, glancing at the door as if expecting Mrs. Green to burst in at any moment. Then, with a deep breath, she continued, "I was here the night you were brought in. I wasn't the one who took you in, but I remember hearing things. People talking. The police brought you in after a call from a man who refused to leave his name. He told them he found you on the steps of an old church, wrapped in a single blanket. But there's more." Isabella's heart pounded in her chest. What more? Miss Ellen pulled out a small, folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was yellowed with age, the edges worn and frayed. "I found this in one of the old filing cabinets a few days ago. It's from the night you were left here. I don't know why, but I felt like you two should see it." Sophia took the paper with trembling hands and unfolded it slowly. Isabella leaned in, her eyes scanning the faded text. "The twins are safe. Please take care of them." "We couldn't," Sophia read aloud, her voice breaking on the last word. "We couldn't keep them together. It's not safe for them to stay with us. Please understand. They're better off this way." "Who wrote this?" Isabella demanded, her voice tight with emotion. Miss Ellen shook her head. "I don't know. It wasn't signed. But from what I understand, the decision to separate you, to take you to different places, was made even before you arrived here. Only something changed that night, and you both ended up at St. Mary's instead of wherever they'd planned." "But why?" Sophia whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Why would they want to separate us?" "Because of your appearances, I think," Miss Ellen said softly. "I've seen this happen before. Families, especially ones from certain backgrounds, they struggle to accept differences like yours. It doesn't matter that you're sisters, that you're twins. All they see is what's on the surface. But I think it was more than that. Whoever left you wanted to keep you safe." "Safe from what?" Isabella asked, her voice almost a growl. "I wish I knew," Miss Ellen murmured. "But that's all I have, this note and a memory of that night. Whoever left you was desperate, maybe even scared. But there was one other thing." Miss Ellen glanced back at the door again before pulling something else from her pocket, a small, faded photograph. She handed it to Isabella, who took it gingerly. The image was blurry, but there was no mistaking it. It was of two babies, swaddled together in a single blanket, identical features contrasting sharply. The same features they saw in each other every day. This was with the note. "I don't know why it was never put in your file, but I thought maybe it might help you find more answers." Sophia's voice was barely audible as she spoke. "Miss Ellen, do you think our parents, do you think they're still out there?" Miss Ellen hesitated, then shook her head slowly. "I honestly don't know, sweetheart. But I think they loved you enough to try to protect you. Maybe finding out why they left you will bring you some peace." The sisters sat in silence, staring at the photograph and the note, 100 questions swirling through their minds. When Miss Ellen finally left, closing the door softly behind her, Isabella turned to Sophia. "This changes everything," Isabella murmured, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and determination. "If they wanted to keep us safe, then there's something we don't know. Something that's still out there, waiting for us to find it." Sophia nodded, her tears forgotten. "We need to find out who wrote this. We need to know why they were so afraid." "We will," Isabella said firmly, "but we need to be smart about it. If Mrs. Green or the staff think we're getting too close, they'll shut us down." "So, what do we do?" Sophia asked. "We start by finding out everything we can about the night we were brought here," Isabella replied, her gaze hardening. "No more waiting around. It's time we took control of our own story." And with that, the sisters made a silent vow. They would uncover the truth about their past, no matter what it took. Because whatever secrets lay hidden, they would face them together, just as they always had. The days that followed were filled with quiet determination. Armed with the faded photograph and the mysterious note, Sophia and Isabella began their investigation in earnest. They knew that if they were to unravel the mystery of their past, they'd have to dig deeper than ever before. It started with a plan, one that required patience and precision. "We need to get into the old records room," Isabella whispered one evening as they sat on the worn-out carpet of their bedroom, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. "I heard Mrs. Green say something about moving some of the older files there." Maybe there's something about the night we were brought in. But it's locked, Belle, Sophia pointed out, chewing on her lip nervously. And Mrs. Green's office is right next to it. If she catches us, she won't, Isabella said confidently. Not if we're careful. Their first attempt was during the early hours of a Saturday morning, when Mrs. Green usually took a brief break in the kitchen for her morning tea. Sophia kept watch at the end of the hallway, while Isabella worked quickly on the door. She had learned to pick locks from an older boy who had been at the orphanage a few years back, and though she hadn't had much practice, her fingers moved deftly, the tiny clicks of the tumblers in the lock sounding louder than ever in the stillness. The door creaked open just as Sophia hissed, "Hurry, someone's coming." They slipped inside and closed the door behind them, heartbeats racing. The records room was dusty and cramped, filled with rows of metal filing cabinets. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and mildew. Isabella glanced around, her eyes narrowing. "We don't have much time. Start looking for files from around our birth date." Sophia nodded and began rifling through the cabinets. They worked in silence, pulling out file after file, scanning through faded documents, and placing them back just as quickly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sophia let out a soft gasp. "Belle, look at this." Isabella leaned over, peering at the old typewritten form. It was a report from a local hospital dated a few days after they were brought to St. Mary's. The report mentioned twin infants found at the church steps and noted that they had been examined for signs of trauma or illness. "There's a name here," Sophia whispered, pointing to the bottom of the page. "Detective William Carter. He's the one who brought us here." "Detective Carter," Isabella repeated thoughtfully. "If he was the one who found us, maybe he knows more. But how do we find him?" Sophia asked, her brow furrowed. "This was 15 years ago. What if he's not?" "We'll find him," Isabella said firmly. "But we need more. Look through the rest of the hospital reports. Maybe there's something else." As they continued to dig, Sophia came across another document. A discharge form from the hospital for an unnamed woman. The details were sparse, but the date matched the night they were brought to the orphanage. Next to patient's condition was a single word. "Confidential." "Belle, what does this mean?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. "Do you think this was our mother?" "It has to be," Isabella murmured, staring at the document. "But why is it marked confidential? What were they hiding?" Before they could ponder further, the sound of footsteps in the hallway made them freeze. Sophia's eyes widened in panic. "Someone's coming." They quickly shoved the files back into the cabinet, closing it softly and crouching behind a stack of old boxes just as the door opened. Mrs. Green stood in the doorway, peering inside suspiciously. She glanced around, then turned back to the hallway, speaking to someone they couldn't see. "I thought I heard something," she muttered. "But I suppose it was just the wind." She closed the door, and they waited, holding their breaths, until the sound of her footsteps faded away. "We need to go," Sophia whispered urgently, grabbing Isabella's arm. They slipped out of the records room and dashed back to their bedroom, adrenaline coursing through their veins. Once inside, they leaned against the door, trying to catch their breath. "Did you see that discharge form?" Sophia asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "There's something really strange about all of this. Why wouldn't they put her name down? And why would it be confidential?" "I don't know," Isabella murmured, shaking her head. "But there's definitely more to this story. We have to find this Detective Carter. He's the key to finding out what happened." But tracking down a retired detective wasn't going to be easy. They spent days trying to gather any information they could. Sophia managed to borrow an old laptop from one of the volunteers, and they took turns scouring the internet for any mention of Detective William Carter. Finally, after countless searches and endless frustration, Sophia stumbled upon a small news article from a local paper. It was an announcement about the retirement of a Detective William Carter after 30 years of service. "He's still alive," Sophia exclaimed, nearly jumping out of her chair. "And look, he's living just outside of Boston. Belle, we have to go see him." "Slow down, Soph," Isabella cautioned, though her eyes were just as wide with excitement. "We can't just show up at his house. What are we going to say?" "We'll think of something," Sophia said determinedly. We have to talk to him, Belle. He's the only one who might know who our parents are. Isabella bit her lip, considering. It's not going to be easy. If Mrs. Green finds out we're planning to leave, then she can't find out, Sophia interrupted. We have to do this, Belle. Don't you want to know? Don't you want to understand why they left us? I do, Isabella whispered, the vulnerability in her voice breaking through her usually composed exterior. I want to know everything. Then we go, Sophia said firmly, gripping her sister's hand. We find him, and we get the answers we deserve. And so, the sisters began to plot their escape. They knew it would be risky, that if they were caught, the consequences could be severe. But this was their chance, their only chance, to uncover the truth that had been kept from them for so long. They would face whatever obstacles lay ahead, just as they always had. Because together, they were unstoppable. The journey to Detective William Carter's home was an adventure in itself. With no money and limited knowledge of the world outside the orphanage, Sophia and Isabella had to get creative. They slipped out early one morning, long before the staff at St. Mary's woke up. Sophia had saved a few dollars from the odd jobs she did around the neighborhood, cleaning yards, running errands for the elderly, and sometimes helping out at the local grocery store. They used this small sum to catch a bus to Boston, clutching each other's hands tightly as the city's towering buildings and busy streets unfolded before them. Detective Carter's address, which they'd found in an old news article, led them to a modest suburban neighborhood. The houses were small but well kept, each with neatly trimmed lawns and hedges. The sun was just beginning to set when they finally reached his house, their shoes scuffed and their clothes rumpled from the long journey. Are you sure about this? Sophia whispered as they stood in front of a plain, white door with a brass number plate that read 57. Isabella nodded, though her hands were trembling. We came this far, Soph. We have to know. Sophia took a deep breath and pressed the doorbell. They waited in tense silence, the sound of their own breathing loud in the stillness of the evening. Finally, the door swung open to reveal a man in his late 60s, with a face etched by deep lines and hair that had turned a snowy white. His eyes, sharp and blue, narrowed as he took in the sight of the two girls standing on his doorstep. Yes? Can I help you? He asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Detective Carter? Isabella asked hesitantly. The man's expression shifted, his gaze becoming guarded. I'm retired. Who's asking? Sophia stepped forward, holding out the old photograph they had brought with them. We're Sophia and Isabella. You found us at a church 15 years ago. We think you might know something about why we were left there. Detective Carter stared at the photograph for a long moment, a flicker of recognition passing through his eyes. Slowly, he stepped aside. Come in. They entered his small home, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The living room was cozy but cluttered, filled with bookshelves and old case files that seemed to spill out onto every available surface. He gestured for them to sit on a worn couch, and then sat opposite them, his expression unreadable. Why now? He asked quietly, his eyes never leaving their faces. Why come looking for me after all these years? Because we need to know the truth, Isabella replied, her voice steady. Mrs. Green and the others, they won't tell us anything. But we found a note and we think there's something more to our story, Detective Carter sighed, leaning back in his chair. I always wondered if this day would come, he murmured. You girls deserve to know. But I need to warn you, the truth isn't going to be easy to hear. Sophia swallowed hard, her gaze flickering to Isabella's for reassurance. We're ready. He nodded slowly, then began speaking, his voice thick with emotion. I remember the night I found you both like it was yesterday. It was the middle of winter, cold enough to freeze your bones. I got a call from an anonymous tip, someone claiming that there were 2 babies left on the steps of St. Paul's Church. By the time I got there, you were both crying, wrapped up together in a single blanket. It was a miracle you weren't frozen. Do you know who left us there? Sophia asked softly. Detective Carter rubbed a hand over his face, as if trying to erase the memories. I don't know for sure, but I have my suspicions. There were some complications that night. When I tried to trace the call, it led nowhere. And when I took you to the hospital, the doctors were already aware of a Situation? What kind of situation? Isabella pressed, her voice tight. He hesitated, then leaned forward, his gaze intense. Your mother was at the hospital that night. She had given birth to you both, but things weren't typical. From what I could gather, your parents were involved in some kind of internal family dispute. It had to do with you too. Your appearances. Our appearances? Sophia repeated, confused. Yes, your father's side of the family, very wealthy, very powerful. But they were also very old-fashioned. When they saw that you were born with such different skin colors, they didn't take it well. It became a huge issue, and there was talk of separating you at birth. Your father tried to fight for you both, but there were too many people involved, too many opinions. It got ugly. There were threats made, accusations thrown around. In the end, your father did the only thing he could to keep you safe. He left us? Isabella whispered, the betrayal raw in her voice. He didn't want to, Detective Carter said gently, but he was scared for your safety. The family, his family, was adamant about splitting you up. They didn't see you as twins, as sisters. They saw you as a problem that needed fixing. When your father realized that keeping you meant you'd be torn apart, he made the hardest decision of his life. He arranged for you both to be taken somewhere far from his family's reach, somewhere you could stay together. Why didn't he take us himself? Sophia asked, tears streaming down her face. Detective Carter sighed again, his shoulders slumping. He couldn't. There were legal issues, and your mother. She wasn't in any condition to care for you. There were too many people watching, waiting for him to make a move. If he tried to keep you, you would have been separated anyway. So, he found a way to hide you both at St. Mary's. He paid off people, made sure your records were buried deep. Isabella clenched her fists, a fiery anger building inside her. So, he abandoned us to protect us. That's supposed to make it okay? No, it's not, Detective Carter admitted quietly. But he did it because he loved you. He thought it was the only way to give you a chance at staying together. Where is he now? Sophia asked, her voice breaking. Is he still alive? Detective Carter looked down, sadness and regret etched into his features. Your father. He passed away a few years after you were left at the orphanage. There was an accident. Car crash. It was ruled an accident, but I always wondered if it really was. Sophia's sobs filled the small room, and Isabella reached over, pulling her sister into a tight embrace. Detective Carter's voice softened as he continued. Your mother disappeared after that. Some say she left the country, others say she might not be around anymore. But I don't know for sure. The sisters sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelations pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. Their parents had tried to protect them, but in doing so, they had left them to grow up in a world that didn't understand or accept them. What happens now? Isabella whispered, her voice hollow. That's up to you, Detective Carter said softly. I have a few contacts who might know more about your mother's whereabouts, but it's a long shot. And your father's family, they're still out there. Powerful, dangerous. If you go looking for them, you need to be prepared for what you might find. Sophia looked up, her tear-streaked face set with determination. We deserve to know. We deserve to know everything. Isabella nodded, her jaw clenched. We'll face whatever comes. We've done it before. We can do it again. Detective Carter watched them, a mixture of pride and sadness in his eyes. You two are stronger than anyone I've ever met. I'll help you however I can. And with that, the sisters took the first step toward confronting the past that had been kept from them for so long. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but for the first time in their lives, they had a direction, a purpose. They would find out who their parents really were, why they had been left behind, and what role their father's family played in their abandonment. Because no matter how painful the truth might be, it was their truth, and they would uncover it together, just as they always had. The weeks following their meeting with Detective Carter were a whirlwind of new information, emotional highs and lows, and the daunting realization that their journey was only just beginning. With the detective's help, Sophia and Isabella managed to piece together fragments of their family history, uncovering bits and pieces that revealed a tangled web of prejudice, family feuds, and love that had ultimately been overshadowed by fear and societal pressure. They learned that their father, Daniel Whitaker, had been the youngest son of a prominent New England family known for its old money and even older values. His marriage to their mother, Maria Castillo, had been a scandal from the start, not because she was from a different background, but because she was Latina. The Whitaker family had reluctantly accepted the union, but when Sophia and Isabella were born with starkly contrasting skin tones, it ignited a firestorm of conflict. There were rumors in the family that your father wasn't your biological father, or that your mother had betrayed him, Detective Carter explained one afternoon over a cup of coffee. But the truth was, Daniel loved your mother and you girls fiercely. He fought against the whispers, against the family's insistence that you two be kept separate and hidden away. But when it became clear that keeping you together meant losing you both to the family's control, he chose to leave you at St. Mary's to give you a chance at a life free from their influence. It was hard for Sophia and Isabella to accept that the same family that had wanted to split them up might still be out there, living comfortably, untouched by the pain they had caused. A powerful mix of anger, sadness, and confusion simmered inside them, and it wasn't long before they made the decision that would change everything. They would confront the Whitaker family. It took several more weeks of searching, during which Detective Carter reached out to old contacts and acquaintances to track down the family's current whereabouts. Finally, they had an address. The Whitaker estate, a sprawling mansion hidden behind high gates and towering trees, was located in the affluent suburbs outside of Boston. Sophia and Isabella stood outside the estate one chilly afternoon, staring up at the imposing iron gates. They had made the journey alone, determined to face whatever awaited them without dragging Detective Carter into the fray. The mansion loomed before them, its grandeur a stark contrast to the humble orphanage where they'd spent their lives. "Are you ready for this?" Isabella asked quietly, her breath misting in the cold air. Sophia nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly. "No, but we have to do it anyway." They pressed the intercom button, and after a tense pause, a disembodied voice crackled through the speaker. "Yes? Who is it?" "This is Sophia and Isabella Whitaker," Isabella said, her voice steady and clear. "We're here to speak with the family." There was a long silence, and then the gates slowly swung open, revealing a winding driveway lined with meticulously trimmed hedges and old oak trees. As they walked up to the front entrance, they couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. They had never been here before, yet it felt eerily familiar, like a place from a half-forgotten dream. The front door opened before they could knock, and an older man in a crisp suit stood there, his expression blank and inscrutable. "The family is expecting you. Please, come inside." The interior of the mansion was breathtaking. Marble floors, high ceilings, and walls adorned with priceless artwork. It was a world apart from the plain, worn-out rooms of St. Mary's, and the stark contrast only made the sisters' hearts ache more. They were led through a series of hallways until they arrived at a grand sitting room, where 3 people were waiting. An elderly woman sat in a large armchair, her back ramrod straight, her face a mask of cold indifference. To her left was a younger man in his 40s, his gaze appraising and curious. A third person, a woman who looked to be in her early 50s, stood slightly apart from the others, her expression a mixture of discomfort and defensiveness. The elderly woman spoke first. "You must be Daniel's daughters." Her voice was calm but held an edge, as if daring them to deny it. "Yes," Isabella replied, her gaze never wavering. "We are." The woman's lips pursed. "Why are you here?" "We came to find out why," Sophia said, her voice trembling slightly. "Why you wanted to separate us. Why you made our father leave us." The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. The elderly woman, Daniel's mother, they realized, let out a long sigh. "I suppose you have a right to ask those questions. But the answers won't change anything. They'll change everything for us," Isabella countered, taking a step forward. "We've spent our entire lives wondering why we weren't good enough, why we didn't fit, why we had to grow up without parents, without a family. Don't we deserve to know?" The younger man, who they guessed was an uncle, spoke up then. "It wasn't about you not being good enough," he said softly. "It was about the family, the reputation. My mother, your grandmother, believed that having twin granddaughters who looked so different would bring too much scrutiny. People would ask questions, make assumptions, and what about love? Sophia asked, her voice breaking. Didn't that matter? It did, the uncle murmured, glancing at his mother. But not to everyone. The elderly woman's eyes flashed with something. Regret, perhaps, or maybe just anger at being confronted. I made the decision I thought was best for the family. Daniel was young and foolish. He didn't understand what keeping you both would mean. Your mother was unwell. I didn't have a choice. You had a choice, Isabella said fiercely. And you chose wrong. The woman's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. It was the woman standing apart, Daniel's sister, their aunt, who finally broke the silence. I tried to stop it, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I begged my mother to let Daniel and Maria keep you both. But I was overruled. Sophia and Isabella exchanged a glance, the weight of the revelation hitting them like a tidal wave. Their family had torn itself apart over them, leaving them to bear the scars. What do you want from us? Their grandmother asked finally, her tone weary. An apology? A place in the family? We want the truth, Isabella replied. And then, we'll decide what we want. The conversation that followed was raw and painful. They learned about their parents' desperate struggle to keep them, about the prejudice and fear that had driven their father's family to such drastic measures. There were no apologies, no promises of acceptance or belonging, but there was a sense of closure, a sense that the shadows that had loomed over their lives were finally being illuminated. When they left the mansion that evening, the sky was dark, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. Sophia and Isabella stood at the gates, looking back at the grand house where their story had begun so many years ago. What now? Sophia whispered. Now we move on, Isabella said softly. We know who they are. We know where we came from. But that doesn't define us. Sophia nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. You're right. We have each other. That's all we've ever needed. And that's all we'll ever need, Isabella agreed. With that, they turned away, leaving the Whitaker estate, and the pain it represented, behind them. They had found the answers they sought, but more importantly, they had found the strength to move forward. Together, they were ready to face whatever came next, no longer defined by their past, but empowered by the bond that had always kept them whole. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's truly emotional.